So today we're going to be looking at evidence for Noah's flood, which is a big part of the reason why I had you read the account of Noah's flood before today's lesson, so that you could kind of have that fresh in your mind. It's page 69 in your workbook, lesson 17. And the question is there evidence of the flood? So a lot of times in this course talking about the creation and evolution debate, I have appealed to the flood to explain a lot of the phenomena that we see today. And so today we're going to be focusing specifically on the evidence of the flood, which in large part is the phenomena that I've been using the flood to explain. It works both ways. If we see something in nature and the flood is an acceptable explanation for what we see in nature, then that thing becomes evidence of the flood. But now is a good time to remind you that the struggle for evidence, see, a lot of times we think that we have the creationists and the evolutionists, and they're trying to find as much evidence as they can from the same, you got like a basket of evidence here, and inside the basket you've got red balls, and you've got blue balls, and what the two sides are doing is, let's say the blue balls are evidence for creation. So the creation guy is trying to get as many blue balls out as he can, and the evolutionist guy is trying to get as many red balls out as he can. And the winner is the side with a bigger pile, right? Does that make sense? So if there's more evidence for creation, then creation's better. If there's more evidence for evolution, then evolution is better. That is not quite correct. The reality is more like the two guys are fighting. Oh, I should have picked blue and no, I don't have any. Oh well. The reality is more like the two guys are fighting over the same ball, and the ball's color is not determined yet. So it's kind of red and blue. And because the real issue is that all of the different pieces of evidence, and then these are neither red nor blue because they haven't been discovered yet. But the real issue is that the evidence is all the same for everybody. There exist fossils buried in layers of rock all around the world. There exist stratified layers of rock that span continents all around the world that appear to have been deposited by water. There exists, all of this evidence that we have, and the evidence is not necessarily in favor of one explanation or the other, but rather the question is, when we look at a piece of evidence, are we looking at it through the lens of creationism or the lens of evolutionism? So, for example, when we see rock layers that appear to have been deposited by water all over the earth, a creationist says, well, duh, that's evidence for Noah's flood. But an evolutionist says, oh no, this is evidence for a very, very, very old earth where, at one point this part of the earth was underneath an ocean, and then plate tectonics moving around and stuff caused that plate to rise above the ocean to where it is today, above sea level. And this rising and falling might have happened many times over the billions of years of Earth's history, and those billions of years can be uncovered when we dig through those rock layers. So the evidence is the same. The evidence is that there are rock layers all around the world that appear to have been deposited by water, and the difference is just how it is explained. And what we as creation scientists want to do is to demonstrate that the creation explanation is the right way to view the evidence. And that's not always easy because the evolutionist side is doing the same thing with their explanation, and their explanation is able to change to fit new evidence. So if we find some piece of evidence that says the Earth is, or rather the Earth can't be the way that they say it is, then they'll just say, all right, fine, then I guess it's this other way instead. Whereas we are kind of stuck with the history of the Bible. And one of the fascinating things is simply that the history in the Bible unchangeable as it is, has withstood the test of time. That even though we're constantly finding new evidence from the pot, we are always able to interpret it in light of the history of God's Word without having to change or modify that history. Oops. And the same goes with Noah's flood. So we're looking at page 69 to start us off, and it's worth noting that Noah's flood was indeed universal. This was not a local flood. I think your homework tonight is going to deal with that question a bit. You know, a lot of people say that when God flooded the world and Noah built the ark to preserve himself and the animals and stuff, that was actually a local flood. One of the most interesting explanations I've heard is that the Mediterranean Sea used to not be an ocean. If you're familiar with the Mediterranean Sea, it looks something like this. You have Spain and Portugal down here, and then over this way you've kind of got Italy. You know, Italy looks like a boot kicking a football there, and then a little farther and you have Greece, and then you get into Asia Minor, and then down here is kind of where Israel is, and then you cut across here, across North Africa, you got Egypt and stuff, and it kind of makes its way around. And right now, of course, this is all full of water. But I once heard a theory that I didn't look into how credible it might have been, but a theory that supposedly says that at one point there was land going from Spain, Iberia, that's what that's called, down to North Africa, something like this, and that all of this was dry. And so they said that maybe Noah's flood was actually, Noah was somebody who lived in this very, very large region, and that this dam here eventually broke, and the water started flooding in like crazy and filling this all up because, you know, it's way below sea level in here. And so it's a popular idea to say that Noah's flood was local.
Wouldn't that mean that the animals everywhere else didn't die?
That they didn't die? That's correct. Yeah. So there's a lot of problems with Noah's flood only being a local flood. And one of the big ones is, in fact, it took a long time and a great deal of effort to build a boat to withstand this flood. And if you're telling me it was just a local flood, then Noah and the animals could have just left and gone somewhere else. These are not impassable cliffs here. These are just the tops of what would be mountains. So if Noah and the animals and stuff were living in here, they could have just left in the time it would take to build a gigantic ark. Yeah, that's one of the big problems with the idea that Noah's flood was local. There's a number of others that we will talk about, or that you'll look at in your homework for tonight. I have you reading just a short article, it's 2 pages, and answering some questions about it. But some of the evidence that the flood was global and that it actually happened is in the orange box at the bottom of page 69. I kind of like this box here. There are more than 270 historical counts of worldwide floods outside the Bible. It's one of those things, remember how I mentioned how dragons, these gigantic reptiles, are present in virtually every culture in the world? North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, everywhere you go, they have stories of these ancient gigantic lizards that they call dragons. And that to me is very suggestive that dinosaurs, which are what we call giant reptile creatures, coexisted with people, and we have written accounts of it. And so also then, the fact that almost every culture in the world, well, not almost every culture in the world, but there are over 270 cultures that pass along historical accounts of a worldwide flood, that itself is pretty strong evidence that it actually happened. Or a skeptic would say, well, that's just a really easy thing to imagine. Anyone who's lived through a flood might wonder what it would be like if the whole world were flooded. But to me, it's pretty strong evidence that it's an actual historical event. And then these other ones here talk about specific flood accounts that are very similar to the Bible. For example, the Hawaiian flood account tells of a man named Nu'u and his family who build a canoe with a house on it and fill it with animals. That sounds kind of familiar. There's one Chinese flood account that says the man took his 3 sons and 3 daughters aboard a boat to survive a flood that covered the highest mountains. Paintings of this account depict a dove with an olive branch flying toward the boat. That's really specific from the Bible, yeah, and absolutely not required in any given myth about a flood. So that's another place in history that agrees with the biblical account. Yeah?
So do you think that like all of Noah's sons, they obviously spread out and made like cultures and stuff? Do you think the stories were just passed down from Noah's sons?
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's why like a lot of cultures have
Mm-hmm.
story.
Yeah, something that happens that affects the entire world should be attested to by cultures all around the world, even if it's an ancient event. Yeah, and do you remember what event triggered the spreading of Noah's descendants out into the world? Because they all kind of hung out together for a few generations.
Oh shoot, I forgot. What?
They settled in a city called Babel,
And
or
they
Babel.
broke up the languages.
That's right. Yep. And they wanted to build a tower, and they were expressly defying God's command to spread out and inhabit the earth. And yeah, so then God confused their languages, and that forced them to spread out from there. And there's actually, I believe it's Genesis chapter 11, is a genealogy, which I know those are usually kind of boring, but it's a genealogy called the Table of Nations that actually names many of Noah's descendants, sons and grandsons, talks about where they went and what their cultures were called. And those names, some of those names line up really well with known ancient cultures, and others of those names are speculated to be this culture or that culture, but there isn't. The names don't always survive for thousands of years. There's one more flood narrative here on page 69. The Apologetics in Mexico tell of a flood that came 1,716 years after the creation, and this fits the biblical genealogy really closely. And after the flood, the people started building a tall tower to protect themselves from the next flood, but their languages became confused, so they had to abandon the project. These are not Christian cultures. This is China, this is pre-colonial Mexico, and this is pre-colonial Hawaii. That these
the
cultures.
Mexico one's like really small.
Yeah, I know, isn't it? So they none of them is identical to the one in the Bible, but you wouldn't expect it to be, because oral traditions, they can become corrupted over the ages and modified and stuff like that. But just the fact that so many oral traditions of the same event exist is itself strong evidence that it is an actual historical event. Page 70, have you guys heard of the Ark Encounter in Kentucky? Our church actually sent a group there. Heard of it? Yeah. Our church sent a group there last summer, and almost every summer you can find some church in the area that is sending a group to the Ark Encounter. So I'd really encourage you guys to go. It is a museum that takes place almost entirely inside of a life-size reproduction of Noah's Ark. And for all of the exhibits and evidences that they have in the museum, honestly, the most impressive thing about it is just how big it is. This thing is massive. You look at that thing and you're like, okay, I guess I can see how Noah would fit all the animals on the ark. Because that's a big question that critics have. How could Noah fit 2 of every animal on the ark? It's like, well, maybe you should see what the ark actually looked like. Because the Bible does say how big it is. That was in your homework that was due today. It was, 300 cubits long by 45 cubits wide by 30 cubits high, something like that. And
maybe the animals weren't like as diverse as they were today.
Very good. So applying what we've learned before, we recognize that animals had less diverse ancestors that could be the fathers of many different species of animals today. Yeah, there is probably the most interesting exhibit to me on the Ark Encounter is probably the most boring one to anybody else, but it is a wall of text. It is roughly the size of these 2 boards put together with very small letters detailing the exact scientific classifications of every family of animals they believe was on the ark. And they've got it down to a precise number, and they've laid out on their museum, like with maps and stuff, exactly where these specific animals would all have been kept, how big they would have been, how much space they would have needed, how much food they would have eaten, and all of that. It's very, very well researched and well done. But it's also really boring. It's a list. But I know, as a guy who has generated research-based lists and whatnot, that it takes a lot of work to come up with something like that. So I really admired it, even though I didn't get to spend too much time checking it out. But anyway, page 70 is all about the Ark encounter. Outside of Williamston, Kentucky, crowds board a bus and head into the wooded countryside. As they come over the hill, they suddenly see a gigantic wooden ship on the horizon. Built according to biblical specifications, the Ark encounter invites visitors to experience the history and science behind the flood account found in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. Take a look at some of the information visitors can find in the Ark encounter. So this is basically like a commercial for the Ark encounter. But it's a good place to go. It's worth advertising for. I would, what's the word I'm looking for? Not ship it, but it is a ship. I would put it out myself. So, will it float? All right, these are all questions that critics of the flood account in the Bible tend to ask, right? So they'd say the ark wouldn't even float. I've heard that wood is not a good structural material, that, there's twisting motions that happen and different forces that hit boats, and you just can't make wooden boats that big. But marine engineers, people who actually know what they're talking about, say that the design and dimensions of the ark match those of modern ocean-going commercial ships. So through the power of science and trial and error and what have you, our best engineers have figured out the exact best dimensions to make an ocean-going vessel. It can shrink or grow according to availability and demand, but the proportions are the same. They're always supposed to be roughly, I forget what it is, but the point is that the proportions of modern ocean-going vessels match the proportions that the Bible gives for Noah's Ark. And Noah was definitely not, Noah might have been, but Moses, who wrote the account of Genesis, Moses was definitely not a seagoing engineering type. He lived in a desert and wandered for 40 years around the wilderness, nowhere near the ocean. So he was not a shipwright. And for Moses to have just dreamed up these dimensions, which actually, centuries later have been proven to be the best proportions for an ocean-going vessel, is very unlikely. Yeah?
Do you think Moses was the founder of Christianity, or was it Jesus, kind of?
Christianity would be Jesus.
Yeah. But Moses kind of wrote the first parts of the Bible.
Yeah, Moses did write the first parts of the Bible, but even what he wrote was stuff that happened long before himself. Yeah. He communed with God one-on-one, so he's kind of the poster boy for the inspiration of the Bible, that God would give him the words to write for things that he didn't experience himself. And he probably, wrote down some oral traditions that were passed down from his ancestors going back to Abraham, but he had God right there who would literally just be like, don't write that, Moses, that didn't really happen, or something like that, and make sure that he gets it right to
so does that
preserve
mean
among his
that,
people.
The Jews believe the Torah, right? So does that mean that they're still kind of waiting for a Jesus type thing?
They are, yes. Yeah, the Jews are still waiting for the promised Savior that is prophesied in Isaiah and pretty much every book after Isaiah. Not everyone, but most of them prophesy some kind of Messiah, is what it's called, a Savior who will redeem the Jewish people. And even though there's a lot of evidence in the Old Testament that Jesus is that Messiah, modern day Jews reject that and say that we're still waiting for Messiah. We have a whole unit on Jesus coming up in this class, where we will talk extensively about the evidence for the person and work of Jesus. So I'm glad you're already thinking about that, because we're almost done with this, with the creation evolution unit. So we'll do creation evolution, and then we're going to talk about the authenticity of the Bible as a historical document, and whether it's reliable, which of course it is, but we'll talk about why. And then having established that, then we'll look at the account of Jesus in particular. And then with the rest of our time together, we'll look at various questions that you guys might have. I'll give you one really easy homework assignment where you just pick your favorite questions from the remaining chapters in the course, and then we'll talk about them. But yeah, we got to get that foundation of apologetics and creation, evolution, and Word of God, and person and work of Jesus. Those are essentials for every Christian to know. Where else we at? Ethnic diversity. I think we talked at length about this with our discussion on races and stuff, but if Noah and his family had medium colored skin, they could have easily given rise to all skin colors on Earth today. There's a very interesting twin study. There's a pair of twins. I wish I could remember their names, but if you look them up, they were born in India to a medium brown skin family, medium brown skin parents. They're both have the same parents, born at the same time, and one of them is very dark, and the other one is very light. One of them looks like it's from Africa, and the other looks like it's from Europe, and yet they're both born from regular old Indian, like from India, kind of Indian parents. And the reason they were able to do that is because all humans have the genes to produce all skin colors. It's just a matter of which ones tend to dominate. And when you have a pair of medium brown parents, as those two were, then you can end up, pretty far on either end of this color spectrum. So yeah, your skin color is really just how much melanin is in your skin. It has nothing to do with anything else. It just affects the way that you look. We really obsess over that in our society, sadly. Room for the animals. The dimensions of the ark provided over 1.5 million cubic feet of interior space. Scientists estimate there were probably about 16,000 individual animals on the ark. This would only have taken about half of the space available. So not only was there room for all the animals, it wasn't even that crowded. I mean, granted, the animals were in cages, so they probably were happy to be done, but we keep animals in cages in the zoo for many years, so they were probably, they were all right for the 1 year they were in the ark. And Noah and his family would have had room for their own private quarters, not to mention storage for food and stuff.
Yeah, I was about to say, they probably had to need a lot of food for every animal.
Yeah. And the ark encounter, so the Word of God doesn't say much about how the ark was built other than its size. And so there's a lot of really fascinating engineering questions, like what do they do with all the waste, or how do they store water, or drinkable water, because presumably the flood water is going to be too salty. Although maybe it wasn't, I don't know. But they have really fascinating answers to those questions. Not that they know for sure, but basically, if you can come up with an answer that is actually possible with the kind of technology we assume Noah had, then it becomes at least plausible, right? Have you guys ever watched the show Mythbusters? It's kind of an older show now, sadly. Oh, it's a shame. It's these two guys, and they would use science to test out urban legends to see if they're real or not. But they can't actually say if it's real. The best they can do is say it's plausible, right? So if what's a good example? There's some ancient story about a town that learned that they were going to be under attack soon and they had no way to defend themselves. So overnight they built a cannon, and with the cannon they were able to defend themselves against the invaders. And so the Mythbusters were like, could that really have happened? And so they they got tools that would have been available in ancient Europe. I think it was an English legend. And they got like a big old stump of an oak tree, and they spent all night trying to drill a hole in it. And they were like, well, it would take a lot of work, but it is plausible that could have happened. Did it happen? But it's plausible. And so the same way with the Ark encounter, a lot of times we don't know how it all happened exactly. But the fact that science can demonstrate that it's plausible means that the ark, you can't just throw away the story of Noah's flood as some ancient myth that is inconceivable or whatever. It is plausible. And then water everywhere, the last one. If the earth were smooth like a billiard ball, there would be more than enough surface water to cover the entire globe 1.9 miles deep. The biblical description of the fountains of the great deep bursting forth explains some of the massive changes that occurred on the earth in the flood. So this is something that I am not the best at drawing, but are you guys familiar with what's called plate tectonics?
Yeah.
Let's start with
Oh
that.
yeah, we learned that in 6th grade.
Okay, very good. Isaac, have you heard of plate tectonics before? So basically, like the Earth's crust. If you imagine the surface of the Earth, a lot of times you just think it's roughly. I mean, there's mountains or whatever. We got some mountains there, maybe an ocean, or we'll call this a lake over here where it goes down. But generally, and that's ridiculously deep for a lake, so it's going to be fairly shallow like that. But generally, the Earth's surface is like this. In reality, what we observe today is that the crust of the Earth is broken into chunks, and these chunks are called tectonic plates. And earthquakes and things like that happen where two plates meet because these plates are not completely still. They are very, very slowly moving. And when you have something this big moving, even if it's very slow, there's a tremendous exchange of energy involved. And sometimes that makes it shake a little bit. And sometimes they even move apart, which makes a literal crack in the ground where maybe there hadn't been one before. And also, of course, there's magma in the lower layers of the crust and then the mantle under the crust and all that. And so sometimes the magma makes its way up through one of these cracks, and you end up with a volcano or some other, I think it is always called a volcano when magma comes out of the surface of the earth. So all that to say, we don't know what the earth was like before Noah's flood, but when the Genesis account speaks of Noah's flood, it's not just rain that comes down, but it seems to be triggered mostly by the fountains of the great deep bursting forth. And Stacy Lung at Lutheran Island Camp, she is a PhD now. She's Dr. Stacy Lung, and she got her master's in geology. And she likes to talk about how the fountains of the great deep were probably not just water, but also magma. That the tectonic plates may very well have been formed in Noah's flood as water, groundwater and magma and other stuff made its way very quickly to the surface of the earth, and you kind of got volcanoes erupting all over the place, and these tectonic plates are going to be moving with a lot more speed than they are now. Now they're barely inching along, a few inches every year. But maybe when all this stuff first started happening, they would move at a rate of several feet per year, I think is what she said. I should have her come in and talk to this group sometime. She came in last year, but I didn't want to bug her 2 years in a row. But she spoke about how with the magma underneath the plates, it would basically act like a lubricant that would allow them to move a lot more quickly if they were being pushed all around. And as far as mountains, which is the reason why I started this discussion, so the flood account says that the highest mountains in the world were covered 15 cubits deep with water. So that would mean that the water was like this high all the way around. Let's pretend this is Mount Everest. So it's, the top of it is barely covered, 15 cubits higher, and so the rest of the world then would have this much water. And the question might arise, well, where did the water go? And the answer is that it's still there. The ocean was a lot smaller before Noah's flood, but after the waters covered the earth, as the tectonic plates began to shift and move, they would crash into each other. And when, imagine my hands, this will be easier to show you with hands. Imagine my hands are two tectonic plates, and they come together with a great deal of force. They don't just bump because they're not perfectly rigid. They're going to buckle and bend. And you might end up with something like this, where one of the plates bends downward like this and another one bends upward. And so the plates hit each other, and suddenly you have a lot more depth in one plate and a lot more height in another plate. And that is actually how evolutionists explain mountains as well. They say that the Appalachian Mountains on the east coast of America are an older mountain range because they aren't as high. They've been exposed to more wind and weathering and wear, and so they must be older and are being slowly worn down. Whereas the Rocky Mountains, for you that would be over here, Appalachians on the east coast, Rocky Mountains going through Colorado and stuff, the evolutionists say those are newer mountains because they are sharper. But they agree that mountains are raised up by tectonic plates hitting each other. And they hit each other in all different ways. Sometimes they'll go up right at the fault. Sometimes they'll go down right at the fault. Sometimes one will go underneath the other one in what's called subduction, where you've got one just kind of eating another one kind of, which of course then on the other side of the subducted plate opens up a gap. So all of this stuff happens when the tectonic plates move, but the end result is that you have deeper oceans and higher mountains than you had before. So I was actually wrong when I said this is Mount Everest, because this is going to be way lower than Mount Everest was. Mount Everest would have actually been raised up by tectonic upheaval after Noah's flood, because imagine if you've got so this is kind of a close-up of tectonic plates, and I'm really overemphasizing how much they would flex here. But if you've got a whole bunch of really high-pressure magma and water shooting out of the plates like this, they're not just going to sit there. They're going to move. They're going to slide away from each other. And then if you imagine over here, you've got this plate is over here sliding this way, and then there's another plate over here with the same problem, pushing it this way, that when these two plates collide, then you're going to end up with some buckling that might result in something like this as the plates move. And so then now there's a whole bunch of new space to hold water and a whole bunch of mountain on the other side. So if this were true, you would imagine that the middle of the oceans would have some of these deep trenches running through them, right? That would be a scientific prediction you could make based on this theory. Well, guess what? They do. There is a mid-Atlantic trench going through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That is the deepest part of there. And then you might be more familiar with the Marianas Trench under the Pacific Ocean. I think James Cameron drove a submarine down there to check out how barren of life it was. The film is not very exciting, but I'm sure the journey was exciting for him. But yeah, so in the middle of our deepest oceans, there are these gigantic trenches that have fault lines running through the middle of them. A fault line, I forget if I mentioned this, a fault line is where two plates come together like that. So not only does Noah's flood account explain where mountains and stuff came from, high mountains and deep oceans, but it also explains how the earth could have been covered with water for a while, and then the water actually did settle into the lowest parts of the oceans and stuff like that as the oceans became deeper. And as far as, Noah's Ark was in a special place. The Bible says that God blew the water back from that area with a strong wind. So you imagine God kind of helped move the water along to where it's going to end up. But that's how the water went. And then there's a lot of water stored in the ice caps as well, the polar ice caps. But that does not explain where it's all going to go. So the climate change advocates that say that when the ice caps melt, the world's going to be flooded, they're exaggerating just a bit. Florida will be flooded. Yeah. I'm not saying that the melting of the ice caps wouldn't be catastrophic and very bad, but it would not lead to the whole world being flooded.
Wouldn't that
mean
that Antarctica would actually have land and it wouldn't just be ice?
Right, yeah. Presumably underneath all that Antarctic ice there's actual land. Not presumably, there is. And yeah, if the Antarctic ice cap were to melt, then that land would be exposed. there'd be less of it exposed than you might expect because the sea is going to rise up, the sea level will be higher. That's why I say Florida will be underwater, because Florida is like just a few feet above sea level. So yeah, that might go bye-bye, but you won't be getting a global flood. Just a lot of displaced Florida men, which frankly is, nobody needs that. There's more evidence though on page 71. You thought I was done, but there's all kinds of great stuff. Rock solid evidence. A worldwide flood would certainly leave behind evidence in the geological record. As you study the accounts of the flood, consider this evidence. And we already talked about the bottom box, but I have a note here to talk about that one first. Fault lines and plate tectonics. When the fountains of the great deep burst forth in Genesis 7:11, the earth's crust fractured and bent, causing mountain ranges to rise up while other areas sank, forming the ocean depths. So that's pretty much what I tried to illustrate over there. Folded sediments. We've already read this in 2 different homework assignments now. The Grand Canyon and other locations around the world show folded layers of sedimentary rock. This is not possible unless the rocks experienced great upheaval from earthquakes or shifts in the Earth's crust. Aquatic fossils. This should be a new one. Fossilized shark teeth are regularly found in Wyoming. Do you guys know where Wyoming is? Is there a lot of a lot of coastline in Wyoming? A lot of oceanfront property there? No, Wyoming's nowhere near the ocean. It's one of the most distant places from the ocean you can be in America, except maybe Minnesota. But, but in any case, Wyoming is very, very far from the ocean, and yet shark teeth are regularly found in Wyoming. Where the heck are these things coming from? Well, it's because Wyoming used to be underwater. And yes, that particular piece of evidence is kind of one that we both agree on, but you can't deny that that is evidence of a global flood. Even if they want to try to twist it to fit their narrative, you can't deny that it fits very nicely with ours. Let me see. Shells and other aquatic fossils appear on the Himalaya mountains in Nepal. So again, a mountain range. The Himalayas are the highest mountain range in the world, and yet there are marine fossils on top of them. So how would that be? I have to remind you that this would not have happened within a year. This would have happened, over quite a bit of time, centuries maybe even. So plenty of time for marine fossils to accumulate on the Himalayan mountains before they get pushed up. Fossil beds, there's that middle square there. Massive fossil graveyards with mixtures of animal species exist in North America, Siberia, and other places around the world. Massive coal beds made from compressed plants and animals are found around the world. So where did coal come from? Scientists, evolutionists I should say, because the creationist side has like legit scientists with PhDs and stuff. This is not some wackadoodle fringe movement. There are, it's not a bunch of religious guys trying to pretend to be scientists. But evolutionary scientists say that coal formed, over millions of years. Everything takes millions of years. Coal formed over millions of years from decomposed plants and animal matter and what have you. And creationists say that almost all of the coal and oil in the world formed during Noah's flood, or as a result of Noah's flood. It still probably took some time, but that is the time when all of this organic material, these plants and animals that would later become coal, where they were all buried and subjected to the high extreme conditions that are required to turn them into coal and oil. Which does emphasize the limited nature of these things. We're not going to get more coal. We're not going to get more oil. The coal and the oil that we've got is what we've got. And unless we find a way to make it artificially, and by that point I think we would just be done with it, we are going to run out. So it's a limited resource. And the reason why they bring up these fossil graveyards with mixtures of animal species is because that is what you would expect to find. Let me see, I guess I'll erase our evidence guys for now.
So there's like fish and animal fossils kind of?
I think it might be fish too, but I think what they're more referring to is animals that would not normally coexist are all found together. And if you imagine, suppose you've got like, a steep mountain and then maybe a hill and then, a coastline, and the flood starts. The flood in most places around the world was not this huge torrential wave that you might be thinking of. But rather, the flood would have simply been that the ocean is here, and then the next day it's here, and the next day it's here. And so the creatures that live near the ocean would be, migrating toward the land there. This is supposed to be a four-legged thing. And of course, any people down by the coast would also be migrating, and they would be seeking higher ground. And as the water rises, you're going to have more and more creatures and less space. And I can only imagine what sort of thing would be, what sort of things would be happening there. But eventually, you might hit something like this, where you have essentially an island, and the humans might be smart enough and capable enough to see that that they need to keep going higher, and so they might get up to high ground. But you'll end up with a lot of animals that get, buried in a place like this, where the water rises and they've got nowhere to go, and so they drown and fall to the bottom, and then all of the sediments that are being kicked up by the flood would then very quickly settle on top of them, and now you have them in layers. In generally, the more complex, better developed creatures would be able to get higher up, and so that helps to explain why there tend to be simpler creatures lower in the fossil record, and then more complex ones the higher up you go. Although that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, like your book says, there are graveyards where there are fossils of all kinds of creatures that are all stuck together that clearly died at the same time in the same place. And this also is evidence of the flood hitting a critical point locally that caused everything to die in that general area and be quickly buried. That's the other thing, is it's really hard to make a fossil in nature, because when something dies, it very quickly begins to rot, or it gets eaten by scavengers, it gets torn apart by predators, and there are not very many dead bodies that remain intact for a long time in nature. So when something dies, in order to be fossilized, it has to be buried almost immediately. And we find fossils all around the world, and the evolutionists say, well, that's because we have millions of years of burial. But fossils all around the world is exactly what you would predict from a global flood event, where you have all of the sediment falling down on the corpses of creatures all around the world at the same time. And that is probably another reason why the fossil record has marine animals at the bottom layers, mostly. The evolutionists say that's because fish evolved first. And we would say, well, no, it's because fish were already there. Fish were the first things to get buried because they weren't trying to get out of the water. They were just like, hey, it's raining mud. Oh, crap, I'm buried. Whereas animals would be like, hey, the water's rising. Let's get away from it. Get to high ground.
Do you think some of the fish survived, or?
Yes. Yeah, Noah was told not to take any fish on the ark. They would be just fine out there. I'm sure a lot of them died when the waters receded. If you're a lucky fish, you would get carried by the current all the way up to the ocean. But if you're an unlucky fish, you would get carried into a local puddle that eventually would dry up because it isn't fed by rivers, and then you die. Mount St. Helens. This is an interesting one. Fourth box from the top. You familiar with Mount St. Helens?
Yeah, my grandma and grandpa live, and my dad actually were living in North Dakota when this happened, so they got a lot of ash.
Yeah, it's a huge volcanic eruption. Most volcanoes, when they erupt, it's kind of like, the stuff just bubbles to the surface. You might get a little bit of shooting here and there, but Mount St. Helens was a sealed chamber that was building up more and more and more pressure, and it was literally a bomb. When it finally broke, it exploded outward. It was extremely violent, and it happened in the year 1980. The massive volcanic eruption in 1980 changed the rules about sedimentary deposits. In the minutes following the eruption, layers were deposited in a way that was previously thought to have taken millions of years. So before Mount St. Helens, evolutionists would say, well, these layers must have been deposited over millions of years. And creationists would be like, well, no, they weren't. And evolutionists are like, okay, how do you think they were deposited? And creationists might say, like, I don't know, the flood maybe? And an evolutionist would be like, we've never observed a flood doing this. But then Mount St. Helens happened. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, I guess we have observed floods doing this. Because one of the big things with Mount St. Helens is that the ash and lava flowed into a lake. And you ended up with this huge mudslide of boiling hot mud that went careening down the mountain. And it carved out canyons in the rock, very much like the Grand Canyon, and it laid down sediments of rock that were previously thought to have taken millions of years. And then we saw that a volcano can do it in days, and hours maybe even. So yeah, seeing events like that should really cast a lot of doubt on the narrative that the Earth has to be millions of years old in order for this fossil record to make sense. And climate change. Here's one where, so climate change as a contemporary issue is not something we're going to discuss in this course, but it is something that's been observed in the history of the world. Recent Antarctic expeditions have discovered, that's in Antarctica, the South Pole, have discovered fossilized remains of a thick forest that once covered much of the continent, indicating that the climate was once very different there from its present frozen condition. So we haven't really talked about how a worldwide flood would affect climate change, but it totally would. And there's evidence of ice ages that have taken place in recent times. And I think I mentioned how a lower sea level during an ice age would have allowed creatures to travel to Australia across land, and similarly over Alaska, from Russia to Alaska, which is how the current theory goes that Native Americans arrived here. Unless you are a Mormon, in which case you think that they came over in a boat from Israel, which is silly. Yeah, the Mormons believe that Native Americans are the lost tribe of Israel. And it's and they were cursed with dark skin for some reason. It's really messed up. Yep, that's in the Mormon teaching. So dum dum dum, as the creators of South Park put it. Yeah, and it's kind of a shame for Mormons that DNA evidence has now demonstrated rather solidly that Native Americans are descended from East Asians and not from Israelites.
Doesn't that just disprove the whole religion, bro?
A big part of it. Yeah. Well, we already know that Mormonism is wrong, so it's nice to hear when the evidence agrees with that. Ark implications. We can't talk about the flood without talking about what it means symbolically for us, not just historically. In the liturgy for Holy Baptism, which we're going to do this Sunday, we have a baptism of 5 kids happening, the Thunberg family, who've been coming to church a lot lately. The adults are being confirmed, and the kids are being baptized this Sunday. And in the liturgy for Holy Baptism, you find a flood prayer written by Martin Luther. The prayer opens with these lines: Almighty and eternal God, according to your strict judgment, you condemned the unbelieving world through the flood. Yet, according to your great mercy, you preserved believing Noah and his family, 8 souls in all. So that one little prayer, which is also reflected in 2 Peter and 1 Peter. Yeah, I always hate that your book quotes 2 Peter here when there's a better one in 1 Peter. But the epistles of Peter connect holy baptism to Noah's flood. And they both involve water. And for Noah's flood, it was the ark that was basically baptism. The world was destroyed, and yet Noah and his family were saved because they believed in God and built an ark as a result of that belief, of that faith. And so the ark of faith protected them. And in the same way, we who are baptized are also protected from eternal death and damnation by the faith given to us in baptism. And a good reading from 2 Peter 3 to end our lesson for today. For they, that is Peter's opponents, deliberately overlook this fact, that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water, that means like flooded, and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. So not necessarily that the whole world will be covered with fire, but that when Jesus returns in judgment, it will be as a fire. We talked about that. Was that in church on Sunday, where I mentioned being purified by a fire? It might have been last Wednesday. But the Bible speaks of, I think it was Sunday, the Bible speaks of Jesus' return being like a refiner's fire. Metallurgists use fire to purify metals. You can melt gold, and you've got a pool of liquid gold with some rocks that you don't want at the bottom, and then you can scrape away the rocks. Or maybe they float on top. I don't know the densities. But regardless, melting the gold in fire helps to eliminate the impurities, and then you're left with more pure gold. So the fire of Jesus' return is going to purify those who are in him, who have gold in themselves by faith, but then it's also going to burn away those who have nothing in themselves, who are lost in their sins. So all of that connects to Noah's Ark, which, for all of the scientific evidence of it, it remains mostly a cautionary tale about what happens when God passes judgment against sin, and also gives grace to those who believe in him. I'm not a big fan of lesson 18 in the book, but we only have 1 week before Christmas break, so I think we're going to go ahead and do lesson 18, get that one out of the way, and then after Christmas break, we'll start fresh with talking about the Bible as an authentic text, rather than specifically looking at the creation-evolution debate. If you have or think of any other questions related to science, creation, evolution, geology, fossils, anything at all. If you've got a question about millions of years that comes up, like, if the earth is not millions of years old, then how do you explain X, Y, Z? Please ask those questions. But especially, please ask them next week, because we got all this stuff fresh in our minds. But you don't learn if you don't ask. So never be afraid to expose your ignorance or something like that with a question. I love good questions. You're not a doubter, you're not a critic, you're not an ignoramus. You are learning. That's what you're here to do, and I want to facilitate that. So, any questions right now before we finish up? All right, let me give you your homework and your graded papers. So there's Isaac and Andrew and Riker. And I'll put a nicer number on top of Riker's pile. There you go. We all got nice numbers showing. You can come up and get your papers as well. I'll just leave this stuff here. We've got your. This is the 1 Peter passage. Is the one you're going to memorize. The one about that connects the flood to baptism.